Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, folks. It's V, the Guerrilla Economist, and we have with us a man who needs no introduction at this point. It is the one and only Matthew Ehret. You can find his links over in the description box. He is a brilliant mind when it comes to geostrategic, geopolitical, and the geoeconomic. So, folks, if you don't have your notebooks handy, I suggest you go get one. And brace yourselves, because Matt's going to be taking us through the rabbit hole of real information, real data, real analytics, real explanation, real history. So get ready. And with that being said, Matt, what's up, buddy? How are you?
Hey, good to be back on, V.
Well, man, it's going to be exactly 24 hours from now that a new administration will take power here in the United States. There are some who believe that right now, as we're speaking, that the Martians have parked their UFOs right underneath the Potomac and are ready to storm the gates with the Patriots in order to win back the White House, as well as end globalization and bring in this new pantheon of laws and advancements and technology, and we'll have peace for 1,000 years. Are you ready for that, Matt? The question is, are you ready?
We could dream, eh? We could dream. Well, it is crazy. Yeah, like there's even some narratives that I'm seeing cooked up that are telling people that, you know what, even if you do see Biden being inaugurated, it's actually not real. It's all a computer generated image to deflect from what's really happening, which is the mass arrests that we've been talking about for the past months. They're finally happening right now while Biden being inaugurated. It's not happening. Don't worry. So even in the weeks after this inauguration, whatever the world might look like, there will be a lot of people who are buying into this, thinking that, oh no, Trump is actually still the closet president. This is all a show. Nothing is real.
So basically, Biden's having a Coachella concert.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like what they did in the Coachella concert, where they had a holographic Tupac Shakur come back from the dead and sing.
Oh my God, yeah. I just knew the Michael Jackson version, right, where they brought back his face and body and remixed a few songs.
That's it.
Yeah. Exactly. It's all the holiday.
Oh man. Matt, where do you want to take this, man? I mean, there's a lot going on. 24 hours is going to be a whole new day. What do you expect going forward with this new administration? I said in the previous show that the Democratic Party is not as uniform as people like to think it is. I mean, it's split between the progressives, the far-left socialists, and the establishment Democrats, which are no different from the establishment Republicans. They're one and the same. I think it's going to be continued gridlock and basically a political shit show for the next 4 years, while these idiots are squabbling and putting on kabuki theater while America swirls the drain. I think there's a 10-year bull market that's going to happen. They got to stick the inflation somewhere. It might as well be a Dow 50,000 at this point, Matt.
Yeah.
And go ahead. I'll break that down for us, and also, how is the world, the world of adults, in terms of nations who have their stuff together, nations who have 4, 5, 10, 20, and 30-year plans, unlike our country, which have 2-year plans, because our country is run by 99.9999% lawyers. Go ahead, Matt.
Right. Well, I think the best thing that can be said is that out of the last 4 years, there has been a more clearly defined existence in people's minds, those who have not totally allowed their brains to melt, but there's been a better, clearly defined idea of not one America that most people had going into 2016. They just thought of, if people were politically astute, their idea of America was as, this imperial battering hammer against poor nations and a police state psyop on its own people. There was not a lot of patriotism, but I think that there was a valid rebirth of something which was genuinely forgotten. It was a genuinely nationalistic, patriotic tradition within the United States that emerged when the Republican Party started cannibalizing itself, and Donald Trump emerged and started activating these historic traditions that involved putting the U.S. into a situation where it was actually acting both locally but also internationally for its own interests. As flawed as that was, the fact that Trump did kill, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Other measures of globalization, like the North American Free Trade Agreement, which he brought back in the mandate that allowed for sovereign nation states to have a say over economic affairs, which was illegal under NAFTA. Also, the idea of not starting new wars and even pulling out troops and disengaging the U.S. military from the CIA overseas were all many elements to this. And he won a lot of very powerful enemies from within the Republican Party, and many people who were formerly disenchanted Democrats ended up even voting for Trump in 2016. I'm persuaded that quite a few former Democrats also voted for him in 2020, but that's another story.
Right.
Now, the thing is, we have people who no longer believe in the party system. Many of the neocons, the most rabid Project for a New American Century psychopaths, who brought us things like 9/11, the Patriot Act, the anthrax false flags in 2001 in December that created the BioShield Act of 2004, which created an entire new international Pentagon CIA operated bioweapons security architecture, right? With BSL-4 labs all over the world, 24 outside of the US, 11 inside of the US, as part of this whole, new age of global war. This is all of these figures who were part of the Republican Party in 2000, 2001, under Bush and Cheney, all broke away while Trump was in there, and now they're all working as Democrats, effectively, right? Like Cheney, his daughter, Ashcroft, Bolton. A lot of these guys are openly working with and supporting the Biden administration. Because it's really the same beast. So the idea of parties somehow being different in this age is not true. It's you have human beings and you have this other, some call it deep state, shadow government is another name, whatever you want to call it. There's this other entity that doesn't care about nation states. It actually loathes nation states. It loathes the Constitution. It hates the Republican traditions of the United States. And then there's the people who have been induced to drink its Kool-Aid, who are walking around like, glazed over, eyeballed, brainwashed people walking into traffic to avoid you on a sidewalk because they're afraid of COVID. Who are just like, they can't wait to get their COVID certificates so that they could like travel again, and somehow things will magically be back to normal once we're all vaccinated, which is again another topic of another discussion, I suppose. But so you have two Americas that have been more clearly defined, which has some very good elements under certain conditions. Biden, what we've seen coming, especially after the events on January 6th, has been a premeditated policy of extending the Patriot Act in ways that we had never seen before, in terms of really, really pushing through this new meme of domestic terrorism, right? That people who were supporters of Trump are all now possibly domestic terrorists, white supremacists. And we have, all of the crazy activity with big tech, the mainstream media, and other things really advocating this idea that it was okay to censor, to kick off people from social media in the tens of thousands, to censor the president himself, which has disturbed a lot of nations externally, who, including, Vladimir Putin, AMLO in Mexico, even Merkel,
Right.
who's not a great person unto herself. She's been a failure on so many levels, but even she has been victimized by the Five Eyes on repeated occasions, and has come out saying this is really a threat to world security.
Even the French were shocked.
Even the French. Yeah, the French. So, you got problems when the French are acting more reasonable than...
this is how... we are literally the epitome of the definition of fascism, where the state and the corporations are working in tandem for a common cause, a common good, a common agenda. This is what fascism's all about, man.
Yeah, you got it. And and so this is the dangerous thing, right? We have with Biden's first 100 days, looking at the resurgence of these deep state actors. A lot of them are Rhodes Scholars, like Susan Rice.
Oh God.
We have people who we know are tied. Almost all of them, all of these people coming in with his cabinet and the new administration, are people who are very deeply implicated with George Soros. Victoria Nuland is the third most powerful person in the under the Secretary of State. in the State Department. So we have this whole resurgence, and the first 100 days under Biden already is just looking completely dismal in terms of what's being celebrated by these psychopaths. We have things like, you know, the fact that Biden is going to recommit the United States to the Paris Climate Accords to decarbonize the USA by 2050 with some strange computer model that has told people that by somehow cutting down massively carbon emissions, you're going to lower the world temperature by a degree or two, and thus stop burning on Earth Armageddon a la Noah's flood. I mean, so we're going to get into that. And nobody, of course, looks at the human implications, right? Like how many lives are going to be shut down by destroying the means of producing industry, agriculture on a level that is needed to support 7 billion or 8 billion or more people on the earth. That's not even looked at in these discussions. It's all about these computer models that talk about flattening the curve of global warming, right? Because we can see these computer modeling projections using selective questionable data sets into the deep future, 10, 20, 50 years in the future, where we could just forecast a complete Armageddon, and we're told we have to flatten the curve of global warming. And again, it's the same logic of statistical thinking that we've seen applied for COVID-19. Again, like flatten the curve. How often had we heard that since the beginning? And again, what are we flattening? It's these imaginary future situations that computer models have been programmed to give us.
We're flattening civilization. We're flattening civilization. That's what we're flattening.
Well, that's the thing, right? What the people who are running and managing these computer models and the psyops, what they really intend is to actually flatten global population and even minimize it. Because in their world, if you're an oligarch looking at a world of human beings who you kind of don't differentiate very much from rats, more troublesome rats, because at least rats don't get new ideas and change their mode of behavior willfully in order to create new situations, new discoveries that make them harder to control. Rats kind of, you know what they're going to do based on their genetics and their environment. Human beings, they despise us maybe even more than rats, but we do have that ability to break from our physical constraints, our genetics, our environment, and make these incredible leaps of discovery when we're passionate, when we have an access to cultivation of our souls, of our emotions, of our minds at the same time. They hate that. So when they look at the world, they're looking at control. And when you see 7, 8, 9 billion people on the earth, many of them have a lot of aspiration and hope for development, especially with the multipolar alliance bringing real long-term development to Africa now for the first time ever, with new financial mechanisms that we've talked about on your show, that are completely outside of the controls of the City of London, of the Wall Street financiers. These oligarchs trying to manage the show from the top, like gods of Olympus, are completely deathly afraid of the fact that any one of these people could produce a new Da Vinci, a new Einstein, a new Tesla that could come out of Africa, could come out of anywhere, and they want to crush that. So they're looking at flattening the curve of human population, and they can't just say that, because nobody would democratically accept that type of language. It's ugly, and it's rightfully immoral. So what they have to do is they have to garb it under these other types of flatten the curve of COVID-19, or get rid of this explosion of terrorist activity internationally. We have to do certain things that are going to quash the growth of international terrorism, or currently domestic terrorism, or in the case of what we just talked about, global warming. And in all of these cases, you could say, well, if these were real crises, legitimately arising crises of nature, whether it's terrorism or whether it's actual global warming caused by human activities, which, again, real science, when you actually look at it, there is no scientific link of carbon dioxide with global warming or cooling at all. Records actually show that whenever you look at the deep records of the last thousands of years, the CO2 always moves. It always changes after the temperature changes, for higher or for lower. This is a big secret that, not even secret, this has just been a fudging of the data that's been maintained by the IPCC and some, anonymous groups of experts for a little bit too long, which want to flip the cause for effect. So there's something else heating or cooling the world that has a lot more to do with what our sun is doing, with what our galaxy is doing. And yeah, the idea of trying to link it to this one variable, or maybe combine it with cow farts like methane, is completely incompetent. And there's a lot of real scientists. This is not just me saying this. Is some guy in a study There's a lot of very, very strong scientists around the world who have proven this to be the case, and people can look into that. But all that to say, all of these things are covers for the real agenda, which is lowering world population and getting rid of the pesky institutions of democracy, of republicanism that emerged, especially after the Golden Renaissance, and really exploded even more so after the American Revolution. And these institutions, they want to just get rid of and create a new type of feudal technocratic world order. And Joe Biden is the chosen hologram. We'll keep using that term, but he's the chosen synthetic character who's been put there to bring about this type of thing. And we see that now with the Patriot Act on steroids being discussed by ABC, MSNBC, all of the mainstream media. There's a meme to prepare the psyche of the zeitgeist to the idea that domestic terrorism caused by Trump and these white supremacist, conservatives is really something that we can no longer tolerate free speech the way we used to, since, look at what happened. That was Trump speaking freely, and it causes terrorism, like the 3 people who died, on January the 6th.
Yeah,
we are preparing a new Patriot Act bill on.
Meanwhile, the globalists could cheer and clap and applaud and condone the $2.5 billion that were destroyed by the burning of several cities in the United States, with 47 casualties over the summer. That was okay. That was okay.
That's fine.
Yeah. Matt, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
This is when what you described with the degenerates from Davos and the lecherous lunatics out of the city of London. What you describe from them is this crazy Western model. Now, there is an option. There is a counterbalance to this. And I'd say at this stage of the game, because when you look at the countries that are signed on to the Davos crowd, the Paris Peace Accords and all this other BS and crap, these are all sloughing, decadent, way past their prime, insolvent Western nations. Can you explain to the American public, who's probably hearing this the first time, what the multipolar world is? They're probably hearing for the first time that there's an alternative to this one world, new world order. There's something much better. Go ahead, Matt.
Absolutely. Well, I mentioned earlier the Project for a New American Century, which really takes on, this is an amalgamation of the worst sociopathic elements from both Democratic and Republican parties, both of which had been completely taken over the course of the years after John F. Kennedy, and then especially when Robert F. Kennedy died in 1968. There was a massive infiltration of both parties under the control of a shadow government. So the Project for a New American Century was laid out as sort of a manifesto for the unipolar world after the Soviet Union collapsed, after the Cold War. That was a bipolar era of 2 major poles, 2 major power centers at war during the 50 years or 40 years of the Cold War. The idea of people like Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Kagan, the wife, maybe the husband of Victoria Nuland. All of these guys, what they laid out was, okay, well, how are we going to manage the world under a unipolar order? And this is where they clearly outline, and it's a disgusting language, what is needed to happen in terms of a Pearl Harbor incident that will allow for a massive shifting of the emotions of the people, of the Americans, to accept the very necessary things that they're not willing to accept right now under the pre-9/11 age. Things like the need to go into an invasion into Middle Eastern countries for a new type of policy of a regime change, the idea of allowing for a surveillance state for their own good, to counteract the dangerous potential emergence of China, of Russia. And they're very clear in that document, and the subsequent documents that were part of this policy outline. But they're very clear that the unipolar worldview must be the only one that's acceptable for the end of history. And in their world, just like Francis Fukuyama said in his book, The End of History, it's their idea is history is defined by singularities, by nation states, by new ideas that change the contour of the cultural and political fabric. That was okay for the past, for the last thousands of years, but now, under the new technological age of a unipolar system, we don't need that anymore. We don't need creative ideas. We don't need really nation states. We have a supranational world hegemon, a unipolar, that means one power center, that will tell the world what to do and manage the system of production, consumption, controls, and it had a certain, I guess you could call it a certain flavor under the neoconservatives of the Bush-Cheney age. And it has another flavor to it with the Obama era version of things. It's the same thing, though, really. Just one has the view that the United States should be the hegemon that's intermeshed with NATO, with the other financial centers of London and everything else. Whereas the other view is a little bit more of a different taste, where, the liberals might say, oh, but we need supranational governments that are above even the United States. The U.S. has to be just the simple support to these new international military financial bodies that control population, consumption, pandemics, blah, blah, blah. And so, again, they were very afraid of what they saw in the 90s coming out of the Primakov-Jiang Zemin increasing alliance. That was the head of Russia, the prime minister of Russia in 97, 98, who became one of the leading figures who supported the rise of Vladimir Putin. A very strong individual, but also Jiang Zemin, who had organized many of the Asian countries in 96, 97 to support the New Silk Road. That was a name given to Beijing-sponsored conferences to create a foundation for a new sort of revival of a lot of the policies that had formerly last been seen under President Sun Yat-sen, the first president of China.
Matt,
yes.
Isn't it funny? That the organization the organization of Asian countries, which we've seen with the rise of the ASEAN nations and stuff, that was done by Deng Xiaoping. It was right after the Asian economic crisis, which, when you look at the fingerprints of the Asian economic crisis, that how it happened, it traces right back to Wall Street. It goes all the way right back to the city of London, man.
That's right. And that was George Soros entirely. So George Soros had already cut his teeth getting his stripes on his uniform to become a sort of celebrity of speculating financiers and sociopaths. There was a lot of them, and there still are a lot of them. But he really became a celebrity when he was recruited to do something that involved geopolitically giving the British an excuse to stay out of the Eurozone trapped Maastricht Treaty that they had themselves orchestrated for European countries to abolish their sovereignty and their rights to having sovereign controls over their credit and financial policy. That was what the euro was all about. Anybody dumb enough to walk into the euro policy in the early 90s and sign on to the Maastricht Treaty, they lost their ability to control their economy. So Britain, it's conspicuous that they still have the pound sterling. Why didn't they adopt the euro? And largely a big reason was that they had a crisis, a convenient financial crisis caused by George Soros making $1 billion betting against, as a speculator, the British pound. And that crisis gave them the excuse to say, okay, we have to deal with our backyard here. Just go ahead with the euro. Just integrate. We'll join you later, probably. And so George Soros made $1 billion. British, they got their excuse, and Soros had even met with the governor of the Bank of England right before that as well to coordinate that whole thing. So Soros really was promoted. And we saw what he did in the 90s, and you and I had a conversation back in November on some of what Soros and Mark Malloch Brown, later Lord Sir Malloch Brown, did together, creating the International Criminal Courts in 94, the International Crisis Group as well, as different institutions integrated with the World Economic Forum, integrated with the United Nations, to promote a post-nation state age where nations would lose the right to have judicial decisions made on their own because they're too irresponsible, as we saw with the Rwandan massacre. We can't allow nation states to manage their own either military or judicial affairs. And so this was advanced. A lot of Soros's money through the Open Society Foundations were put into this, as well as other things in terms of drug legalization, you name it, from euthanasia policies, Death in America. That was a Soros initiative. That was all throughout the 1990s, and increasingly the absorption of former Soviet space nations into NATO was also supported by this whole complex. And this is where you have things like today's, Belarus. You got the Orbán of Hungary, who's pushing against the Soros traditions that have really ingrained themselves into their culture throughout the last 35 years even. So anyway, Soros was the guy who was deployed then in 1997 to speculate against what are called the tiger economies. So he gambled against Laos, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, yeah, and just just bought up a lot of their currency. This is the way it works. This is how economic warfare works on a simple level. It gets more complex when you look at it, but on a simple, basic level, the way economic warfare really works, as you see in this case, buy up a lot of the currency, create a little momentary spike of the currency's value by just buying a few tens or hundreds of millions or billions of dollars as a speculator, and then when it's convenient, sell en masse, plunge the value of the currency, cause a massive capital flight from the nation. The nation can no longer support its basic governmental programs. It can't pay its workers. All the social fabric breaks down until that nation is brought crippled to its knees. And if it was a belligerent nation not really obeying the edicts of the City of London or Wall Street, then you will allow it, maybe, if it's fortunate, to modify its behavior around good governance standards and accept, a very, very altruistic gift by the IMF to help them recover, as we've seen with Argentina or most South American, African countries. Everyone got this treatment. And of course, these new loans are going to come with a lot of conditionalities to make sure you don't behave badly ever again. And that was what was done to China's partners. So that really disrupted the organic evolution of the new Silk Road that, again, was blossoming at that time. And Russia was still suffering badly under perestroika. They had gotten brutally raped throughout that entire period through mass privatizations and other things after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they were still just trying to figure out, how are we going to survive? They were going to negative population growth. It was bad. It was really bad. And so Primakov recognized that Yeltsin was a mess. A lot of the Russian intelligentsia recognized that there was no future with Yeltsin, and they maneuvered to create a new situation with an alliance with China increasingly, which created the what was called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
The SCO.
Yeah, the SCO, as a new security architecture. Increasingly, we had the foundations for what became later known as the G20 established. ASEAN was empowered. So these different Eurasian-centered organizations were created as a survivors club, where every nation that didn't want to die, because everyone was on the chopping block. What was done to Russia was never in the 90s was never supposed to stop. That was supposed to continue in the mind of Soros and Malik Brown. So that survivors block evolved. And this is what the neocons were speaking to in the Project for New American Century, when they were saying the rise of Russia and China and other allied nations. Iran was a big one.
I mean, even before that, you had Zbigniew Brzezinski, the Grand Chessboard. They knew back then that the only rival to this Atlanticist utopia is a rival that will emerge out of Eurasia, and they did everything to stop that.
Yeah, and even you see those pictures in the Grand Chessboard where Zbigniew Brzezinski. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you talking?
Yeah. No. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, you see these images of Russia that Zbigniew Brzezinski published in that ugly book, with like Russia divided into like 3 smaller Balkanized countries. And that's really what he wanted. And there's even people. I mean, there's other documents from the Council on Foreign Relations, from the Trilateral Commission, which Zbigniew Brzezinski was a leading member of for many years, that talk about doing similar things with a balkanized USA, broken down into eco zones, eco nations with local, like having 8, 9, 10 even sub nations within the USA that they envisioned as being the proper way of reorganizing the world, because there's something embedded in the U.S. Constitution that gives the U.S. Republic a unique amount of federal power to break the power of private financiers when things like this happen, and they're very afraid of it, because every time they've come close throughout the last 250 years since the American Revolution, every time these oligarchs have come close to achieving their one world government post nation state agenda, and they've tried it many times before. Don't get yourself, this is not the first time, but they failed largely because of what the U.S. has been able to awaken, whether it was under Abraham Lincoln doing what he did with the greenbacks and his multi-level war with Canadian intelligence operations that were tied to Britain and the Confederate secret headquarters that were running economic and other terrorist warfare against the North from Montreal and from Toronto, as well as different things going. I mean, there's so many things that Lincoln did people don't realize. All the way to McKinley or Roosevelt, who did battle with Wall Street and the City of London financiers in 1933. He did battle again in 1944. Or John F. Kennedy, who did not nearly get as much accomplished because he was, we know what happened to him. But what he did get accomplished in the 2+ years he was alive is extraordinarily powerful for one nation to be able to do. And they could only really do that because of the U.S. constitutional traditions and powers that it allows for the government to shut down private financiers like, the Federal Reserve and create alternative treasury-backed notes to provide long-term development for the general welfare of the people. Was not just ink on parchment. The general welfare is the mandate for economic policy making and what justifies economic decision making. So this is the whole thing. Currently, the multipolar alliance has taken on really new life, especially since, I would say, 2013, when Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road, or what was called the New Silk Road, after 15 years of it being crippled, because George Soros's 1997 attacks on Asia destroyed a lot of that potential to make that Silk Road happen. And they had to recover, they had to regroup, re-strategize, create new alliances with Putin. Putin had formally, before 2013 and Xi Jinping's speech in Kazakhstan, in 2007, Putin laid out his Munich conference speech, which is a beautiful speech where he really just clearly states that the world cannot be unipolar. There's no way that is not going to result in nuclear war in a dark age. And he clearly lays out the positive principles for how sovereign nation states can act both in their own interest as well as in the interests of their neighbors. This was given new meaning with and real practical meaning with the creation and the deployment of the Belt and Road initiative in 2013. The fact that it increasingly became intermarried with the Eurasian Economic Union, that was another Russian bloc of nations from Eastern Europe. That integration really took off in 2015. There's been attacks against it, both in terms of asymmetrical warfare, terrorist deployments, as well as economic warfare. But regardless, there's been a steady growth of this unification of nations around this multipolar alliance. And in 2018, you had an Arctic aspect of the Silk Road with the Polar Silk Road. That was a Chinese white paper that manifested more actively in 2019, 2020, with programs to extend the rail, the other infrastructure projects into Russia's far east, which has an immense amount of beautiful potential for alliances, as we're seeing now with nations of the Pacific that have been induced to be enemies with each other by foreign manipulation, like Japan, working with the U.S. military to antagonize China, or South Korea as well, hosting 25,000 soldiers for many years and potentially THAAD missiles directed at China and Russia's southern border as part of the full spectrum dominance. These countries are, as well as India is a big part of this. They're working economically with Chinese companies on Russian development projects in the Arctic as part of the Silk Road of the Arctic. We have a space-based component as well, where Russia and China have signed agreements to begin to co-build within 10 years a lunar colony, but a science station. Not for habitation, but I mean for real science work, and also with an aspect of mining as well, because there's a lot of very interesting things on the moon that would provide a very long-term energy needs met for humanity, including helium-3, which is the best fuel source for fusion power, which China and the leaders of the Chinese space program have been very open that this is really the core goal of their landing on the far side of the moon, where you have these millions of tons of helium-3 produced from the sun just accumulated over epochs that one truckload can brought back to the earth can supply the needs, the energy needs of humanity at a much greater standard of living and quantity and quality of life that we currently enjoy for a year. I mean, that all of the fossil fuels would not be able to accomplish. So,
Right.
I mean, we have just a different way of thinking about value, long self-interest, about economics coming out of the Eurasian Alliance, which the oligarchs have been really working on overtime to destroy forever, but especially with Trump. And their greatest fear since Trump was elected was that the U.S. was going to qualify itself to become a trustworthy ally in that economic bloc of win-win cooperation, because it only works. The Eurasian Economic Alliance, this whole system of the Belt and Road, and the almost 140 nations who have signed on to the Belt and Road framework, it only works to the degree that the nations participating are acting in accordance with their own national self-interest. That's the only way it functions. If you have technocrats who want to reduce the population or create conditions of world government, it doesn't work. They cannot trust you. That's why Canada might be a part. I'm in Canada, right? For those of your viewers who don't know, I'm here in Montreal. I run the Canadian Patriot magazine, and I saw that you had it displayed there as well, so people can have a sense of that. Canada is a part of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, is that a good thing? Sure, it's a good thing. It's not the IMF, it's not the World Bank, and it is providing long-term financing for infrastructure. Those are good things, but China knows they can't really trust Canada under the current paradigm, to the degree that Canada just really is a part of the Five Eyes, and it's a part of this agenda to infuse, like a Trojan horse, very bad ideas into the organizing and governance framework of Eurasia, which would ultimately undermine it. So, I mean, a lot of people are attacking Biden for being China friendly, and they're saying, look, that's a sign that China is, because obviously there's shady deals, right, that have been documented between the Biden family and the liberals, many of the neoliberals of the West, and China. Now, China, I'm not saying is in any way absolved of all complicity in those bad decisions. However, to say the way the Epoch Times or other Steve Bannonite thinkers have, that this is proof that China is the ultimate nemesis of the U.S. out to subvert Western democracy and rule of law and overthrow Donald Trump, that's insane. That's completely absurd, because the people who, like George Soros, Lord Malik Brown that we've been talking about, who are now completely back in power under the Biden administration, and who want a certain type of relationship with China, they have always viewed China as just as much of a threat, if not more of a threat, to their good governance society, their open society of world government, as Trump's USA was. They've wanted to destroy China as much as they wanted to destroy Russia, as much as they wanted to destroy the USA, because they all represent powerful traditions that could break the power of the oligarchy.
Correct. And Matt, real quick, one thing that people don't realize is this: there are four great nations in this world. Okay, United States, China, Russia, India. And if you notice what has been happening between these four countries, how divided they are, how every single one of those countries had City of London Corporation fingerprints all over and meddling all over those four nations. If the globalists can keep those four superpowers separate and fighting amongst each other, then the multipolar world will not come into existence. But I think it's right now past the point where, with or without the United States, and I think with Trump coming on, I thought that this was the third time in global history that this open modular economic system was going to, come full force. Mm-hmm. And Trump and the United States had the chance. Like when China was building, this is a fact, folks, when China started the entire, One Belt, One Road initiative, the United States was invited multiple times to be a part of it. And the leadership of that time, which is the Obama administration, what did they do? They gave the middle finger to them. And they started the Pivot to Asia movement. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Now they're trying to trick all of you guys into thinking that the Chinese have stolen the elections. China. You're going to hear for the next 4 years, China. Was Hunter Biden involved in probably some illicit deals in China? I'm sure he was. But this is the way of geopolitics. You can't get mad at the way the game is played. But you need to get upset with is how the idiots that are in DC are running your country. You want to be pissed off at somebody? Be pissed off at the Washington swamp, and then figure out peaceful, effective ways in order to get rid of that power. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. No, exactly. China has been a situation of, I try to make this point to people. If you look at the causal nexus of world history, which is needed in your mind to understand and make sense of world current events or future events, you have to have a strong sensibility in your mind of where is the causal nexus, the thrust of world history located. And it's really located in the clash of these two opposing ways of organizing, self-organizing our system. That have really expressed themselves strongly with the American Revolution, between an idea that rights are something given by a hereditary class of elites to their peons, and they use a shadow government of courtiers, managers who maintain the institutions of that oligarchical structure, and that's been most of human history has been shaped by that ugly form, that perverted form of organizing ourselves and organizing our philosophy of law and human nature. The other view is that no, everybody is sovereign. There's not just one. Everybody has the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Everybody has these unalienable rights because we're human beings and we are made in the image of a creator, whatever name you want to give it. But the point is, that's the foundation for the consent of the consent of being governed, right? So we elect representatives not to basically just do whatever we want as a mass under consensus, nor do we elect them to be our dictators. But that's where democratic republic is different from both a mob democracy or anarchy versus its opposing dipole extreme opposite of a tyrant, a tyranny. It's not one of those two extremes. It's something more, and it's premised around the idea of maintaining cultural traditions and an understanding that human nature is something which is ultimately perfectible. We're a creature of free will, of reason, of conscience, and we have to maintain those better institutions. There's no formula for success, and I like the way you called the multipolar alliance modular. It's flexible. It's not a fixed thing that we know what it's going to look like. We have a general idea of a certain type of world orientation and certain big things that you want to do, kind of like a thumbnail sketch. When you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, right, with these rail networks from east to west, as well as extensions into Africa and South America and the Arctic and beyond. But you don't know what it's going to look like in 10, 20, 30, 50 years. It's based on a flexibility, allowing for the developmental pathways of nations, even nations who are problematic or corrupt. And that's why China is given a lot of a hard time by George Soros and other good governance technocrats of the West saying, oh, look, they do business with corrupt African countries. They even do bribes. It's like, well, yeah, that's what they were doing with Biden. Like they part of what they're doing is they're it's kind of like Aikido in a sense. And there's problems with this. It can backfire, as we've seen in many cases. But they're like, okay, if that country is corrupt, we need to find a way to create points of dialogue. And they made a strategically dumb decision to think that somehow they could get some traction to get the U.S. to work with the
It looks like Matthew's stream locked up for just a minute, V. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, it looks like his stream locked up.
Matt, even let me see if he's
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Oh, there you go, Matt. You were just locked up for a second.
Okay, what's the last thing you heard me say?
The last thing, it was only for 5 seconds.
5 seconds? Okay. So, China is not the causal nexus of world history. They're currently in a reactive state of trying to figure out how do you survive when you're dealing with this local beast, this world government.
Crazy.
Crazy beast of, City of London with all sorts of military industrial complex arms and branches throughout the U.S. military, which, we've seen that there's hundreds of foreign U.S. military bases, bioweapons bases. A lot of them a lot of them around China's perimeter, around Russia's perimeter in Georgia and Ukraine. We've seen the activation, the use, the creation of artificial terrorist networks through the funding of U.S. allies like in Qatar or Saudi Arabia over the years that have created financial conduits as well as logistical conduits to supply arms to the growth of Islamic terrorism. This really took off under Zbigniew Brzezinski. You said him earlier, but back in the 1970s, late 70s, this was the program to fight the Soviet Union during the Cold War in Afghanistan, was the funding, using U.S. aid and other CIA fronts to fund the radical Islamic mosques that would then create things like the Mujahideen Khalq, that would create the Taliban, who, if you go back to the 1980s, you have Osama bin Laden, who's on the cover of Western mainstream newspapers being called a freedom fighter. So he was a complete synthetic creation, using, again, the conduits of the royal families of Saudi Arabia that were put there by the British, might I add, in the 1920s. It wasn't like people think of royalty, they think of something that goes back hundreds or thousands of years. No, this is just one Bedouin sociopathic sort of family group that was preferred to other groups that were warring for power under British patronage. And at a certain point, the Churchill gang was like, okay, well, let's put these guys in power and let's set up a little security apparatus around them that'll help us destabilize things in the Middle East. That was also part of what the British were doing with the creation of the Balfour Declarations and the Sykes-Picot, which really gave birth to the state of unfortunately, political, the aspect of Israel and the creation of things like the Mossad were also British creations from the get-go, even going back to the 19th century with Lord Palmerston Shaftesbury, who is the world's first political Zionist, as far as historians recognize that this is something which came out of the British Foreign Office.
And Matt, here was the funny thing with the early Zionists. What most Americans and most people don't understand, when you look at the father of Zionism and the earlier guys that are involved in Zionism and whatnot, they're all atheists. They were atheists.
Well, they were atheists, and then at the other hand, when you start scratching the surface of some of these figures, like I brought up Lord Shaftesbury, but you start getting into things like Rabbi Kook, like these different groups who were Kabbalists as well. And when you start getting into these secret societies, the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which is what Lord Shaftesbury and all of these leading original geopoliticians of the 19th century were all a part of this thing, as well as a lot of their leading political Zionist tools. They were all part of this network. This is what the B'nai B'rith came out of too. This is what was used in the Confederacy during the Civil War. Like people like Judah Benjamin, the U.S. Secretary of State for the Confederate, it's not a republic, but the Southern Confederacy. So Judah Benjamin was a leading Kabbalistic Zionist Freemason, as was Albert Pike, who was a leading general for the Southern Confederacy, who later, famously became known as the guy who set up the KKK as a new domestic terrorist group to undermine the danger of Reconstruction that Ulysses S. Grant and the Lincoln allies who had survived were trying to bring about by industrializing the South as a way to replace the slave economy in the 1870s and 80s, which was sabotaged. The KKK creation and the Knights of the Golden Circle that Anton Chaikin, an amazing historian, I've published a lot of his work on the Canadian Patriot. His work has also been published on EIR, and he's written an incredible book called Who We Are. And you might even want to have him on your show at some point. But anyway, Anton Chaikin goes deep into this whole thing. These are all folks who are part of a Kabbalistic sort of brainwashing operation. And when you get into the higher degrees of Freemasonry, like what Albert Pike does in his Morals and Dogma, where he sort of redefines Southern Rite Freemasonry under a new code with new elements to it. It's the same corruption. He's really making the point that the language to communicate with the divine, and a lot of these words he's using are very, very Orwellian. When he says divine, he means Lucifer. He really, what he's actually saying with the Kabbalah is basically it's a form of a Babylonian practice under the cult and high priest sects of ancient Babylon, of Persia, of the cult of Apollo at Delphi. My wife, Cynthia, wrote an incredible article, actually. If people go to the CanadianPatriot.org, it was originally published on Strategic Culture. She goes through it, the history of America's secret police, and they could find it with a picture of Albert Pike and J. Edgar Hoover I think it's like the 6th article from the top. But the Kabbalah is just simply a carryover of self-induced brainwashing, using just putting yourself in a trance, using certain types of aromas and other devices to just really deconstruct your mind, your ability to reason and to see things, to read a sentence as a whole or a paragraph as a whole, as you would normally do if you were thinking about the philosophy of the Torah or the Bible or anything. You would read a thought written as a sentence or a paragraph or a chapter or a story. You'd start with the whole first in your mind. Right. Think about it. Think about the philosophy, what's being said, where's the morality, where's the immorality. You'd scrutinize it, right? With the Kabbalah, it reduces everything to a bunch of symbols that are infinitely interpretable, and you're just looking for sounds. You're making humming sounds based on each symbol. And you're losing your ability to read an idea, and so it makes people really good candidates for brainwashing and terrorist deployment. So this is part of what gave birth to America's secret police force that was created under Teddy Roosevelt, modeling the creation of what later became known as the FBI under Hoover. It was something that was created, modeled on something that the British were doing under I think it was the King. Albert VII or Edward VII, I believe. I mix up their names sometimes, but anyway, Britain around 1907 to 09 was creating MI6, MI5 as two aspects of foreign secret intelligence as well as internal domestic secret policing. Similar things were being done by the Anglophiles and pro-Confederate sympathizers. These two presidents, Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. After McKinley had died, and McKinley was really the last real Lincoln Republican that we hadn't really seen another one until Donald Trump arose over 100 years later. But the idea of creating controlled domestic terrorist groups, right, using anarchist groups, using intelligence agencies like what we've seen with Saudi Arabia, like what we saw with the Mossad, like what we saw with the mafia, even the controlled Cosa Nostra, things like the Bronfman family, who came in and became an immediate sociopathic part of the the illegal drugs and running operations, and obviously alcohol was a big one that got them their start in the early Seagrams, yeah, exactly. Right. I mean,
the heir was involved in Nexium, that whole sex cult.
Exactly. Yeah. And the whole Bronfman dynasty, going back to Samuel Bronfman. I mean, Samuel Bronfman was made a Knight of the Order of Bath. That's a very high level reward by the British monarchy for only those who are in the highest services of the empire. So there was people often they watch Dick Tracy or they watch, popular culture, and they have a very foolish idea of what exactly is this organized crime thing. What is the mob, and they don't realize that it's an interconnected part of one unified deep state structure. And, so you've had people who are patriotic, who fought against this thing. We've seen also how this thing has used and cultivated terror groups to justify the creation of dictatorship-like policies. We saw this with the... I brought up the domestic terrorism of the KKK and the Knights of the Golden Circle, but I mean, if you look at it a little bit later on, you had things like Emma Goldman, the anarchist who organized these weird cults of people who were deployed to kill McKinley or to kill the Tsar of Russia, and many other leading figures throughout Europe were killed by these organized anarchist groups. Also, Prince Kropotkin. There's a wonderful research report by Martin Seif, a friend and a fellow author on strategic culture that I've published some of his work, which is just impeccable on just how these organizations were controlled by British intelligence to destabilize governments and eliminate nationalist leaders who they didn't like.
We have about 2 minutes left. Take it home for us, brother.
All right, 2 minutes. Yeah. Well, basically, right now, if terrorism, if global warming, if these things were actually naturally occurring problems in the human body, I would say that some of what is being done for the Patriot Act number 2 and other things might be in some weird way justified, but they're not. You have an empire at the top infiltrating both people within who are well-intentioned in some cases. You have things around shady operations around QAnon that are being used. You have things on the left like Antifa and Black Lives Matter that are creating very dangerous anarchist groups that are potentially creating a civil war situation inside the USA that's going to justify different forms of dictatorship and the continuity of government, as well as an economic meltdown. You have the only salvation for all of this coming out of the Russia-China alliance that's centered around the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an open system. It's built around a long-term program of creative development, forcing the monetary system and investments to behave according to the higher interests of people as well as of nations.
Right.
This is something which they want the West, they want Canada, they want the US to join. American citizens have to get rid of this idea that China or Russia is the enemy. It's not the case. And maybe in our next program together, we can go into that even in more detail. But this is really it. People have to think about these things. The system is going to melt down. We need to get something in place which will allow the US to recover its traditions. And it may not happen really quickly. There's going to be some serious storms happening really, like as we're seeing right now. But people have to be really well equipped to understand their history, understand what future potentials are available, and then organize accordingly to make those happen as much as you possibly can, with the idea that China and Russia are not your enemy. They are your friends, with everything else going around.
Very well said. And folks, again, you can check out Matt's work right there in the description box. It's everything there is for you. And with that being said, thank you all for listening in. Subscribe, like, comment, share as we go through these challenging times that are ahead. Take it away, CJ.